Hello, Padawan. We are in my favorite module of this course. And I know I say that every module, but this one is my favorite. And I'm going to, full confession, my graduate work was about Kate Chopin and Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter and the character of Hester Prynne, and then a modern play called The Quilters. So I'm going to totally geek out on you, and you're going to hear about things you've never heard of, specifically archetypal patterns in American literature. Don't get scared by those big words. But Kate Chopin, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the two women we're focused on this module, are fantastic. The stories are interesting. You'll like them. But you have to think about how controversial they are in the time in which they're written. So let's start with Kate. Catherine O'Flaherty, Kate Chopin. Her husband died at the age of her age when she was 32 and left her with 6 children to raise. Right? So she had to figure out how to raise them. So she started writing as a way to deal with her depression and her loneliness. She was like this wild flirt in town. She ran his business, but she was lonely, and so she started writing. And her first novel was very popular. It was called At Fault. It was published in 1890, and then she was like an instant hit, and she wrote hundreds of short stories for big-name magazines and publications at the time, including ones that still exist today, like Vogue and The Atlantic. So she was very, very popular. Then she publishes The Awakening, and it's an absolute scandal. It ruins her career. It's the last thing she writes. She tried to write some short stories, but no publisher would take them because The Awakening was so controversial. So what made it controversial? Well, the themes in the book are that motherhood and being a wife aren't the end all be all for women. You know, we think in 2021, no kidding. But, for the time period, you couldn't go around saying that. But that's actually not what angered people. Or upset people. What upset people is that the main character commits suicide in the end. She walks out into the ocean and just dies, commits suicide. So that portrayal of the suicide and the very religious people around whom she lived in Louisiana, it ruined her career. It was considered scandalous and vulgar. So Kate Chopin, it's interesting. Her life is defined by her roles as wife and mother. But she herself had said that she was very inspired by the French short story writer whose name is Guy de Maupassant. And he was a realist writer also, and he wrote phenomenal stories. But his one popular one is about a prostitute who lived during the Franco-Prussian War. And Chopin had said, this guy, he writes about real things and real people, and he paints people the way that they are. And she really liked that style. So that's the style that she adopted. And she is considered part of the first wave of feminism in American culture. Remember we read about Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller, the writers, trying to get women the right to vote. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's another one. These are the first wave feminists. And then after Kate's death, her work went forgotten, and she was revived in the 1960s by the second wave of feminists who lived during the 1960s. So you're not reading The Awakening because it's a little bit longer and it's a little, it's fascinating, but since you already read a novel last week, I don't want to make you read two. But you're reading some really good short stories. And The Story of an Hour is one of my favorite short stories. And I'm not going to spoil the plot, but what happens at the end, you have to say why you think that happens at the end. Why does that happen at the end? Right? So for those of you who are just watching this video and have no idea, you'll have to look up a summary of the story. But the end is why did that happen? So it's a good story. You'll like it. Now let's talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So, of course, not as much is known about her. She was actually married twice. And she was born in Connecticut. So Kate Chopin is a regionalist writer, writing in Louisiana. So that's the first kind of writing that we see coming out of the Creole culture and Louisiana culture. Perkins Gilman is from Connecticut, where we've seen writers before, and her family is well connected. They're part of the Beecher Stowe family, but her father left them when she was little, so she grew up in poverty, and she was moved around a lot. And she had one child named Catherine, and she suffered from postpartum depression, which wasn't called that back then. So nobody knew that's what she had, but she had suffered from depression. And her most famous work is actually not her literary work. Her most famous work is called Women in Economics, because she was she was encouraging women to be economically independent, and so that they would gain their own independent economic wealth so that they could live independently. So she died, she committed suicide because she had inoperable breast cancer. And so she committed suicide because she didn't want to have to go through having her family and her daughter see her that way. And so her work, The Yellow Wallpaper, is her famous piece. And again, great story about depression and mental illness, and really what we would now call postpartum depression. The wallpaper itself is a symbol of the prison of domestic life for women, right? It symbolizes the structure of family and medicine, mental illness, and she felt that and her wallpaper is intentionally ugly and hideous because that was the confines for a domestic middle to upper class woman. Like, that's all it amounted to in the end. And so her work, like Chopin's, was controversial because you aren't supposed to talk like that. So why aren't you supposed to talk like that? Well, you're not supposed to talk like that because there's a thing called the Cult of Motherhood. And that stems from, back to Mary and the figures of Mary and Eve in Judeo-Christian culture, right? So there are women, and you've heard about this in high school, there are women you take home to mom, and there's women you don't take home to mom, right? The archetype of the virgin mother, the archetype of the temptress whore. An archetype is a pattern that exists beyond time or space. So if you're a wolf and you happen to come across a human baby and you raise that baby knows what a mother is, even if he or she doesn't have a name for mother. He or she knows what a mother is because a mother is an archetypal pattern, something that goes beyond any culture, goes beyond any time. Like, we always have known what a mother is. So Carl Jung, who was a student of Sigmund Freud, he had this idea that there are these universal archetypes that frame our understanding of the world. And the archetypes that I looked at in response to this literature, I was looking at what is the American woman in literature, right? Because when we see in world literature, we see lots of texts that are devoted to this cult of motherhood. We see lots of texts that are devoted to the wanton woman, right? The woman out there, taking men down and tempting them away from success and whatnot. The American woman, when we look at her, we have to think about the culture of the time. So the Puritans come over to seek religious independence, and they're very strict for men and women. And then we have, the tradition changes, the pendulum swings. Now we have, women saying, hey, how come I can't vote? So now women are wanting independence. People are moving west to uncharted territory. They're meeting with the native people, the indigenous people, the Native Americans, and their women, had celebrated, a better sense of equality than our Puritan values allowed. So men, when they settled the West, there's this whole idea that there's Adam and Eve, right? And they leave the garden. When they come to America, men get to go settle the West, and they get a new Eden. The cowboy is the brand new American man, and he gets a clean slate to tackle the West and to subdue the West, and he has been absolved of the sin of eating the apple. Women, however, were not. Women had to carry with them, this attempt to be this virgin creature, but all the while being this temptress. So we saw that in Maggie, right? She was trying to be, and was at some extent, that virgin character, but the society's forces weighed upon her, and then she became the temptress, because that's what American culture does, right? Kate Chopin's Edna Pontellier from The Awakening, same thing, right? So she's trying to be a wife and mother, she's trying to do it, but she's not satisfied. She's not entirely happy with that lifestyle. She thinks there's more out there, and if there can't be more out there, if she can't have romance outside of her romanceless marriage, and there isn't life beyond being a mother, what is there? Is it even worth living? External forces, she can't choose. She wants to choose the one, but she can't, because society doesn't allow her to, so she has to walk into the ocean and end it, right? Charlotte Perkins Gilman, main character of the Wallpaper, right? She has these external forces of depression, mental illness on her. She can't change it. This is her fate. Whether she likes it or not, she is stuck in this room. Metaphorically and physically, she is stuck in this room, and that is her fate. So what my study was looking at how women then moving west, they experienced more freedom, because the West was the land itself was hard to subdue, right? So, think Laura Ingalls Wilder, right? Think of the pioneer woman, right? They had to work alongside the men, because they had to, plant stuff, and they had to survive. So all of the politeness of East Coast society, all the politeness of the Southern plantation, all of those, niceties and pleasantries are out the window when you're just trying to survive a cold winter in the Midwest. So while the men got a clean slate, the women didn't, but they made their clean slate. They made themselves by virtue of their work. And when we look at the literature of the play The Quilters, which is a modern play, a musical, we see the sort of the rise of women out of the ashes creating their own Eden, or creating their own escape from Eden, right? So men were granted it, and then women created it. So I love Kate Chopin. I love Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I hope you enjoy this literature. I could go on for days about it, but I'm not going to, because we all have to, eat snacks and go do other things. So, look forward to seeing you next time.